In the last few strange months of quarantine, I wanted to try a new book, a new prototype, but not covered in leather as usual, but in a new covering material. As always, I start out with folding the paper. I fold simple A4 leaves 2 times and cut them, basically making an A6 signature. It's around 15 centimeters at height and 10.5 centimeters at width. For the base of the booklet, I used the same paper that I used for the pages inside the book. I also made a mixture 50-50 with paste, wheat paste and PVA glue. I coated the paper base with this glue and later it will be adhered to a piece of linen. One thing you must be careful of is not to leave too thick strings of glue on the paper, as later when it's pressed on the cloth it may cause stains on the outer side. I sprinkle a bit the linen and apply the paper on top. I use my roller that I used for lino printing to apply pressure evenly. Once done, I pick it up and leave it out to dry. I use some of the book cloth to make inner cloth joints. In this case, this one is already folded and is glued to a piece of handmade paper that I made myself here in the bindery. Again, glue is applied to the handmade paper and the whole construction is attached to an A5 leaf that will later be folded into an A6 signature. I once again use the roller to apply even pressure. I set up my sewing frame with single cords. This book is going to be sewn on 3 of them. The knots need not be too tight, as well as the cord itself. As you can see later, all will be strengthened out with the pillars of the frame. The text block is also ready. I've carved 5 channels, 3 deep enough to accommodate the cord, and 2 on the outer sides, just enough for the thread. Once everything is positioned, the book is ready to be sewn. What I do later is always to trim the edges of the book. This is done by the book plow in this particular motion. I check for any irregularities, and if everything's okay, I proceed to the next edge. Next would be backing. Backing is a technique that involves a round bookbinding hammer or shoemaker's hammer to sort of make a groove on the book spine that will accommodate the thickness of the boards. It's quite the risky process and it requires some practice and technique, or else you might damage the spine. The desired shape is this particular mushroom shape that you see here. I like to make a sort of groove on the inner side of the board to make an even smoother transition from the spine to the cover. I also like to make small channels to accommodate the cords that go from the spine into the boards. Once laced in, I check if the positioning is okay and proceed to glue the cords onto the inside covers. Once the book is dried, I sprinkle the edges with blue ink, and once that is dry I proceed to weaving the endbands. It's good before any project that the knives are razor sharp, so that if you work with leather, you know that you have the ability to make it as thin as possible. This book project is largely inspired by what is called the millimeter binding. Basically, it's a binding that has leather on top and the bottom of the book, or in crucial other places like the corners or head caps. This was done previously in Europe when leather was scarce, and basically you ration leather and use it in the most vulnerable places of the book, while the other part of the book is covered either in paper or in cloth, like it would be in this case. I apply paste to the leather strips and lay on the book on top of it and do my best to attach it. Believe it or not, it's a lot harder to attach a sole leather strip onto the book rather than a whole piece of leather. Because if you have a whole piece of leather, you have a lot more surface, a lot more stability, while working with the wet strip actually makes it a lot harder because you pull on one side and the other gets unstuck. Once all the folds and corners are turned in, it's time for it to spend a little time in the press in order to form the head caps and use a bit of thread on the spine side of the leather strips. Keep in mind that the leather must be thoroughly moistened in order for all of this sculpting to actually have any effect. Once it's dry, you can see that everything fits snugly without imposing any difficulty on mobility of the covers. Cloth covering has already been cut into size, and now I'm making grooves so I can turn in the top and the bottom of the covering. Covering material is pasted, and now begins the careful phase of positioning it on top of the book. As this was my first millimeter binding and my first cloth bound binding at the same time, I wasn't sure how exactly this material would behave. So I wanted to try if the spine would behave the same way as leather would, but it appears it wasn't so. You'll see what I mean in a bit. After the covering has dried, I apply glue on the inner cloth joints and position them adequately so they may dry. Now the prototype is done. It's quite a simple book, quite minimal. I only have a few problems with it. The main one being that the spine makes creases when opened. It looks smooth when closed, but it really changes its image once it's opened. Everything else looked and behaved quite nicely. But I wasn't at all happy with the crooked spine, so I decided that after this prototype I would make 3 more books in a similar manner. But this time I was going to try lino printing on top of the book cloth and see what would happen. I started sketching and carving out a design that I had in mind actually for gold tooling, but didn't quite manage to execute it properly some time ago. So this was a sort of rebirth of this particular design. I plan to use yellow relief printing ink so it would match and be in harmony with the yellow leather strips on top and the bottom of the binding. I always do a test print on regular paper to see if any further work is needed on the cut. In retrospect, this print really looks best when it's fresh, but a few disadvantages of this type of printing, especially with these two colors, is that it dries for a very long time, and after it's dried, the color darkens significantly. But these were the better versions of the prototype. This time I glued everything but the spine, as well as adhered a piece of paper with double thickness onto the spine, so when it's opened you can see a nice groove forming with a bit of a hollow inside, but when it's closed it doesn't seem like it at all. Next, my dad worked on producing 3 simple silver designs that go in harmony with the linoprint design. one of the designs being a beautiful movable circle with branches and leaves. So these are the 3 finished journals of this collection. It was a nice experiment, and I have much more respect for cloth as a covering material, although I'm not sure when again I will do something like this in the future. I hope you like what me and my dad have produced, and if you have any interest in any of these 3 books as well as the prototype, you can see them on my website and my web shops as well. I hope you're all staying safe and keeping in high spirits. Thank you for your support and for watching. Until next time.